The girl clawed at her skin, her nails drawing blood. Drool hung from her mouth. Urine stained her clothes. She was grunting, lashing out, wild, feral. Across the room, the scientists just stared, stunned. She looked like a teenager, at least in age, not in behavior. It was the most disturbing thing they had ever witnessed, and none of it was her fault. Born in 1957, Genie's life was defined by restraints and fear. Her father was a man who couldn't tolerate noise, someone who never wanted children, but found himself with them anyway. Most of them died from neglect before they ever had a chance to grow. But the ones who survived, they learned that sound meant punishment, and it came swift and without warning. Genie was one of those survivors. She wasn't held, rocked, or spoken to. Instead, she was strapped into a high chair so tightly it acted like a homemade straitjacket, pinning her arms to her sides and her legs frozen in place. She couldn't move and she couldn't make a sound. Her father kept a large plank of wood close, and he used it to enforce the law of silence. At around 20 months old, the isolation deepened into something more deliberate and controlled. Genie was moved into a separate room from the rest of the family, the door locked from the outside. From that moment on, she spent most of her time either strapped to a child's toilet or tied inside of a crib, her arms and legs immobilized so thoroughly that she couldn't crawl or stand. There were no toys, no pictures, no stimulation or entertainment of any kind, just blank walls and long stretches of darkness. Her father banned anyone from speaking to her or acknowledging her existence. She was effectively a ghost. The absence of sound and language was so complete, she never developed normal speech patterns or heard the everyday human noises that shape a developing mind. Genie was fed as little as possible, restricted to baby food, plain cereal, and occasional soft-boiled egg and liquids. The only time her mother was allowed to be near Genie was during feeding, but even then all she could do was watch. Her husband insisted she fed the child 3 times per day, but later evidence would suggest that Genie was left hungry for long periods of time. Her mother, almost blind and completely terrified, would risk everything by trying to sneak food into her at night. The house itself was turned into a fortress. Her brother was the only one allowed outside strictly to attend school and return home. Even then, he was forced to prove his identity before being let back inside. No visitors were allowed under any circumstances. No neighbors were welcome. In fact, most of the neighborhood thought the couple had only one child. No one knew about the young girl locked in a room. All the while, her father kept meticulous written records, documenting not only the abuse but the lengths he went to in order to hide it. Genie's mother was beaten regularly and threatened with death if she ever tried to contact her parents, friends, or the police. The son was also targeted, beaten with increasing brutality, and forced to participate in the abuse as he grew older. The boy tried to run away several times, but he was always pulled back into the family, and the punishments grew worse. Then one day, her father made himself a promise. Genie would be dead by the age of 12. But luckily for Genie, this was one promise he didn't keep. Genie turned 12, and for another year and a half, nothing changed. The door remained locked, the restraints remained tight, and the lights stayed off. In October 1970, the silence inside the house finally cracked. A violent argument exploded between her mom and dad. Years of tension and terror spilling into one moment. Genie's mother did something she had been too afraid to do for more than a decade. She threatened to leave. She told her husband that she would walk out if he didn't allow her to call her own parents. And for once, he hesitated and then relented. Later that day, while he was out of the house, Genie's mother gathered her daughter and left. She took Genie to her parents' home in Monterey Park, California. Her son, now 18 years old, was already gone, having run away and managed to stay hidden by living with his friends. After more than 13 years of near-total isolation, Genie was suddenly outside. 3 weeks later, on November 4th, the moment that would change everything arrived by accident. Genie's mother decided to apply for disability benefits for the blind in Temple City, California, bringing Genie with her as she navigated the streets. Unfamiliar with where she was, she walked into the wrong building, which ended up being a general social services office. Inside, a social worker looked up and immediately knew something was wrong. The child standing in the office was silent and rigid. The social worker assumed that she was looking at a developmentally delayed 6 or 7-year-old who was possibly autistic, and then she asked a question: how old is she? When the answer came that Genie was 13 and a half years old, the air seemed to freeze. The social worker didn't hesitate. She brought in her supervisor. Together, they questioned Genie's mother and confirmed the details. The realization hit them. This wasn't a disability case, it was severe abuse. The police were called immediately. Within hours, Genie's parents were under arrest. The house became a crime scene. Genie was made a ward of the court, her fate no longer controlled by a locked door and a shotgun. Because of her extreme physical condition and her near-total lack of social skills, the court issued an immediate order. She was taken straight to the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. For the first time in her life, Genie would receive the help she needed. The moment Genie was admitted, the responsibility for her life shifted into the hands of people who had spent their careers studying the worst things adults could do to children. David Rigler, a psychology professor from the University of Southern California and the chief psychologist at the hospital, took direct control of the case. Working alongside him was Howard Hansen, head of the psychiatry division and one of the earliest experts on child abuse. The next day, they appointed James Kent to perform the first examinations, but no one knew anything about the broken girl in front of them. Most of the details about Genie's childhood came from police files and what was found in her father's notes. In November 1970, news broke of Genie across major media outlets. A single released photograph of her fueled a wave of public fascination and horror. Crowds began gathering, searching for her father, demanding answers. He refused to speak to anyone. The pressure grew unbearable. Then, on the morning of November 20th, just hours before he was due to appear in court on child abuse charges, he used the shotgun he had held the family hostage with on himself. With Genie's father gone, authorities turned their full attention to her and her mother. She told the court that years of beatings and near-total blindness had left her physically and psychologically unable to protect herself or her children. The charges against her were dropped, and she began counseling under hospital supervision. Meanwhile, the first evaluation of Genie left doctors shaken. It was the most severe case of child abuse they had ever encountered. Genie was extremely pale, severely malnourished, standing 4 foot 6 inches tall and weighing only 59 pounds. She had 2 nearly complete sets of teeth, a distended abdomen, and a thick hardened ring of calloused blackened bruising around her buttocks, caused by the restraining straps her father had used for years. X-rays revealed even deeper damage. Genie suffered from an undersized ribcage and a bone age of approximately 11 years old. Her body mirrored her mind as her gross motor skills were almost non-existent. She could not stand straight. She could not fully extend her arms or legs. She walked hesitantly with a strange clawed bunny walk, holding her hands out in front. Eating was another battle. She couldn't chew. She was incapable of swallowing solid or even soft food. Food that wouldn't go down stayed in her mouth until saliva softened it, or she spat it out and crushed it with her fingers. She was also completely incontinent. She showed no reaction to heat or cold. Doctors struggled to measure her cognitive abilities, but on 2 attempts she scored at the level of a 13-month-old child. But she was curious. She explored objects, she studied textures, and showed special fascination with unfamiliar sounds, actively searching for their source. Genie wandered the halls of the hospital, but was uncomfortable with touch. When she was made to sit on her mother's lap, she was rigid, tense, and ran at the first opportunity. Hospital notes described her behavior as highly antisocial and almost impossible to control. She drooled constantly and spat everywhere. She blew her nose on the walls, clothing, and furniture. She had no concept of ownership or boundaries, taking whatever she wanted when she saw it. Genie acted purely on impulse. She responded slightly to gestures and facial expressions and could make eye contact, but her own face remained blank most of the time. She could communicate only a few basic needs non-verbally. Speech meant nothing to her. When she became overwhelmed, she would claw herself, strike herself, and attack her own body, all without a sound. Sometimes she appeared incapable of crying at all. If she needed to make noise, she pushed chairs or dragged objects across the floor instead. Her violent outbursts came suddenly and without warning, with no visible trigger, and only stopped when she was distracted or physically exhausted. By January 1971, linguists determined that her understanding of words was almost non-existent. She recognized her own name, a few others, and roughly 15 to 20 objects. Her spoken language consisted of just 2 phrases, "stop it" and "no more." No one could determine if she had learned any of those words in the brief weeks after her rescue or earlier. Tests found no physical or psychological cause for her silence. There was no brain injury. The conclusion was horrifying in its simplicity. She had never learned language because she had never been exposed to it. Slowly, the people caring for her tried to change the pattern. Marilyn Ridgler, the wife of the chief psychologist in charge of Genie's case, began teaching Genie to direct frustration outward in safer ways. She encouraged Genie to have a fit rather than harm herself. She painted Genie's fingernails and taught her that scratching herself made her look bad. She worked to calm her during moments of overload. Over time, Genie began to show small signs of control. With prompting, she learned to express frustration verbally. She developed a system. If she was extremely angry, she shook one finger violently. If mildly frustrated, she waved her hand loosely. The tantrums and self-harm never disappeared completely, but they began to soften at the edges. The Riddlers would eventually adopt Genie and become her legal guardians. They introduced her gradually to their puppy. After 2 weeks, her terror of their dog disappeared, although unfamiliar animals still sent her into a panic. Marilyn worked with her relentlessly on chewing and swallowing, a process that took about 4 months. Genie hated the effort of solid food and preferred soft textures, but she improved. The researchers tried to connect her to her own body's sensations. It would take years for her to show clear sensitivity to temperature for the first time. After several months, her progress was strong enough that she was first enrolled in a nursery school and then in a public school for children with intellectual disabilities. The Riddlers taught her how to do simple chores. Her control over herself improved in public. In February 1973, almost 2 years after being rescued, Genie shared something with another person for the first time, a moment that marked a significant milestone for the researchers. Though she still took things that weren't hers, the looks on her face showed that she now understood that she wasn't supposed to. Over time, something else changed. She seemed happier. Staff consistently reported that her mood improved and that she appeared content. Even as late as June 1975, David Riddler was still documenting steady progress. But even then, the shadow remained. Her interactions were still abnormal. The scientists could see improvement everywhere, but they could also see the permanent marks of a childhood without language, love, or the outside world. And while they worked quietly behind the hospital walls, something else was growing in the background. Something they didn't yet realize would throw everything into chaos. At first, they believed they were united, doctors, psychologists, linguists, all working toward a single goal. But as weeks turned into months, something uncomfortable began to surface behind closed doors. The people who had rescued Genie were now fighting over her mind. Funding came from the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIH, and with that funding came pressure. Inspectors and committees began to question the study itself. They voiced quiet doubts at first, then louder ones. There was too little usable data, too much chaos in the research notes, and no clear scientific structure guiding what they were doing. Outside of the language experiments, there were no defined parameters. Mountains of information were collected, but no one could clearly explain what any of it meant. But the real conflict exploded earlier. In May 1971, during the grant meetings, voices rose behind conference doors. Some believed that the science and research were beginning to cost Genie her humanity. Genie's advocates warned of the danger that love, attention, and human warmth were starting to become conditional, given only when Genie performed, progressed, or produced measurable results. The meetings grew bitter. The nurses, aides, and staff who understood Genie as a child rather than a subject were excluded. The voices of the people who cared about her as a person were slowly pushed out. After that, something shifted. People working on Genie's case walked away entirely, saying that the project placed research above the child's well-being. Many believed that researchers ended up treating Genie as an object, not a little girl, but instead as a specimen and a rare opportunity, a living experiment. Those at the center of the project denied the claims, at least publicly. James Kent, Howard Hansen, the Riddlers, and Susan Curtis insisted the arguments were professional, not personal. They called the disputes normal, even healthy, in the way that any serious scientific effort should be debated. But the fractures ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Many believed the Riddlers cared for Genie but saw her first as a research subject and not as their child. It was argued that everyone grew too close, too emotionally entangled to see what was happening. Legal and personal relationships blurred judgment. The scientific community as a whole began to argue. Had the team saved her or had they used her? The Riddlers fought back. They said their home was the best possible place for Genie at the time, that they loved her, that she thrived under their care, that everyone involved believed that she was doing well. They insisted that they never stopped caring and that Genie's own mother prevented them from continuing their work. In the end, no one walked away clean. Some scientists said that they did their best in an impossible situation. Others said that they failed her or the system had failed them all. But one truth could no longer be ignored. Genie had escaped one locked room only to become locked in a different type of room surrounded by researchers. But Genie's story didn't end in a laboratory, it ended in a courtroom. In 1978, the fragile alliance between researchers and caretakers was shattered completely. Genie's mother sued the hospital, the therapists, and the scientists. The accusation was simple. Science had been placed above Genie's welfare. The lawsuit exploded into the press. The researchers denied wrongdoing and insisted the truth had been distorted. The case was never tried. Some say it was quietly settled by 1984, while others, including Riddler, insisted it was dismissed with prejudice, never to be filed again. Then, in early 1978, without warning, the scientists lost Genie completely. State authorities transferred full guardianship to Genie's mother. Overnight, access to the girl was cut off. All research stopped, all visits ended. Everyone was shut out except Jay Shirley, a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Oklahoma, who had been working with Genie. What followed was not the ending anyone had hoped for. From 1978 through the early 1990s, Genie moved through at least 4 foster homes and institutions. Instead of healing, some of those places brought new abuses. When Shirley saw Genie at her 27th birthday in 1984 and again in 1986, he described her as deeply depressed and almost completely silent. Years later, Curtis learned that Genie barely spoke at all and had withdrawn into herself. When David Ridgler spoke publicly in 1993, he offered the last known glimpse of Genie. He wrote that she was living in a small private facility, that her mother visited regularly, and that when he and his wife saw her again all those years later, Genie recognized them immediately. Now watch brothers confess to murdering parents, but are they innocent? The Menendez brothers. Or click on this video instead.